Hi, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 17. Mustang from India says the primatologist Richard Wrangham from Harvard gave an exceedingly positive review for your magnum opus, Behave, but pointed out that you denied the violent nature of our hunter-gatherer ancestors and instead believed that warfare began with agriculture. So, what are the respective reasons and supporting evidence for two of the most prominent primatologists of this era to disagree on the origins of human violence? And is there some middle ground to be had here?
Well, first off, Mustang, thank you. I'm most certainly not one of the leading primatologists. I'm a dilettante who does it part-time, just as I'm a part-time neurobiologist. But Richard Wrangham is indeed one of the leading primatologists. And thank you, Richard Wrangham, for an incredibly kind, generous review of the book in, I think, the New York Times. And one of the things that made it most kind was that we've got a fundamental disagreement. And this is one of those that runs through the field, which is basically, oh God, Hobbes versus Rousseau. How long, historically, evolutionarily, have humans been having organized warfare? And this has been like people at the throat of each other about this for a long time. And where Wrangham initially stepped into this in the late 90s was with a book of his Demonic Males. And what he pointed out was chimps have organized violence that begins to resemble warfare, and this was based on Goodall's work. Humans sure do. Each of us is the other's closest ancestor, and the last common was about 7 million years ago. And chimps have like 98.5% of their DNA in common with us. And what parsimony then suggests is the last common ancestor also had organized violence, and it is carried on in us in the millions of years since then. This got some pushback, but it was mostly revised by a pretty important finding, which is bonobos. Bonobos, the other chimp, the forgotten chimp, the chimp that is female dominance and sex all over the place and sex used for every type of decreasing any tensions, and why not just for the fun of it, and very low levels of aggression and nothing resembling chimp intergroup violence. That's had a little bit of revisionism recently. It turns out that male bonobos are a little bit more aggressive than people thought initially, but bonobos really dramatically different from chimps, and 98.5% of their DNA in common with us also, and diverged around the same time. So that did in the last common ancestor argument, and very appropriately, commendably, Wrangham has moved away from that argument since then. So people who are getting into the argument of how old is human warfare, there's two data sets that people wind up arguing over. First one is look at the historical record, look at the archaeological record, look at the paleontological record. What are signs of warfare in the archaeological? People building fortifications or moat things around and stuff like that. That's not very useful because that's a relatively new thing. So let's go back to the bones, to the paleontology literature. And what you see is you find old-time skeletons where there are bones that are freshly broken, or where you could see there's an arrowhead there amid the skeleton, or things like that. And what has been the standard interpretation? This was someone who was killed as a result of violence, and that's why the bones were broken, and with an arrow landing in them as they wound up having no innards anymore except for bones. You find the arrowhead there. And the conclusion from this was that you see evidence of this going way, way back. So at this point, people push back against this. What are the counter-interpretations? First off, going way, way back, you do not see a whole lot of evidence for group massacres, a whole bunch of skeletons piled up on top of each other with broken bones and all of that. Next, the arrow in there. In some cases, it appears as if somebody was buried with their prized weapons and arrows, and that's what the arrowhead is left there. One of the biggest problems, though, with it is the notion that accusations that there was cherry picking of the data, that when you look at the bulk of the paleontological record, you do not see much in the way of evidence for organized violence, organized massacres. Until you get one really interesting exception, which is by the shore of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, an amazing place. Lake Turkana, identified there about a 10,000-year-old paleontological site with a whole bunch of butchered skeletons. And this sure looks like there was violence, and that seems mighty convincing. And these were not farmers. These were not cow people. They were hunter-gatherers. There you go. That's the evidence for it. With one complication, though. Hunter-gatherers come in two different flavors. 99% of human history, it was simple hunter-gatherers who were nomadic. What you begin to see around that time are what are called complex hunter-gatherers. They're not nomads anymore. And these folks there had one great resource, which was a fantastic fishing hole there, which was the main source of their hunting. And they were hunkered in around there. And as soon as you get stuff like that, as soon as you get a really good resource that you're trying to dominate, and you can do it because you're not nomadic anymore, suddenly it occurs to somebody else that it would be a great idea to go seize it. So you don't really see any evidence of massacres among hunter-gatherers until there's been this key transition that they're no longer nomadic, and that's the last 1% of hominid history. Now, the second source of data that people pull from is, they always say, our contemporary ancestors, contemporary hunter-gatherers. And the logic there is obvious. Let's go look at those people whose social systems have been unchanged for 100,000 years, and there's some moderately untouched hunter-gatherer populations left still out there. There's the Hadza in Tanzania, the Batwa in Rwanda, the Mbuti in eastern Congo used to be known as pygmies before that was viewed as pejorative. There's various Inuits. There's a remnant of a hunter-gatherer tribe in Kenya called the Ndorobo, and I love them. I have always rooted for hunter-gatherers because they're just cool, and they're usually short, and I identify with that sufficiently so that my Maasai friends there tease me about how I would like to be an Ndorobo. But okay, so you got hunter-gatherers here and there, so the question becomes, do you see violence in these people? People who are not doing any farming or even horticulture of semi-wild plant stuff and rainforest. People who are not doing pastoralism with domesticated animals, cows, goats, camels, and all they're doing is hunting and gathering. Dogma used to be most of the calories came from the hunting. What now is clear is most of the calories come from the gathering. Dogma used to be most of the calories are coming from man the hunter, the men who were hunting, and oh yeah, women find like little scraps of food. Most of the calories are coming from women in gathering, and what the men are mostly doing is sitting around saying, oh my God, can you believe how amazing I was in the last hunt? I'm going to be so amazing in the next one, while the women are out getting the majority of the calories, often with the maternal grandmother. Okay, so these are people, no farming, no pastoralism with domesticated animals. And do you see evidence of organized warfare? And what the contemporary hunter-gatherer literature shows is, yeah, you do see stuff like that. And this is something that's been emphasized by this anthropologist Lawrence Keeley in a book of his, War Before Civilization, extrapolating backward from contemporary hunter-gatherers. Also Steven Pinker, psychologist, jack of all trades genius, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, going with that argument, because you do see fairly widespread violence in hunter-gatherer groups. So time for the revisionism to come in. And this has mostly been driven by a guy named Douglas Fry, an anthropologist, University of North Carolina, Brian Ferguson at Rutgers, Christopher Boehm at University of Southern California. And what they point out is contemporary hunter-gatherers are not good models for 100,000 years ago. First off, thanks to trade with non-hunter-gatherer groups, they have modern weapons, modern like Iron Age or whatever, things like that. Probably the biggest thing is hunter-gatherers have spent the last 10,000 years being booted out of the best habitats out there by agriculturalists and pastoralists as they come in. The Kalahari, Kung, San hunter-gatherers in Botswana used to be in rainforest before they stopped being rainforest because the Bantu agriculturalists came in and booted them out, and now they're in the desert. They wind up in very degraded habitats. So things are not as easy, and resource competition is much stiffer than it used to be. Probably the most important thing with that is you look at most of these instances, and again, there's a cherry picking. Douglas Fry has done a very good survey of all of the hunter-gatherer populations and has been equally good at making sure the non-nomadic, the sedentary hunter-gatherers, don't count, and the forest horticulturalists don't count, who hunt and also grow wild plants to some extent. Get them out of there and look at the nearest thing we've got to hunter-gatherers from back when, and you see very, very low rates of intergroup violence. And this is really not surprising, because once you think about it, like, how do you pull off things like a standing army? You got to have job specialization. You got to have resources that are in surplus so you could feed your army. You've got to have a hierarchical sort of business of command, and that's not what you see in hunter-gatherers. And when you look at them closely, and this is mostly Boehm's work, you say, okay, well, are we in the Garden of Eden? Was Rousseau right? Do you never see violence among hunter-gatherers? Are they just groovy beyond measure? And no, they are perfectly willing to kill each other for intra-group reasons rather than inter. What are the common ones? The most common primate form of aggression out there, which is one guy killing another guy over reproductive access to a female. One guy killing a woman because she has spurned him, strategic infanticide, ritualistic stuff, hunter-gatherers where you got someone who's got norm violations out the wazoo, and you're exiling them or you're yelling at them doesn't do it. And what Boehm has shown is if and only if there's a community consensus, they'll kill the person because they're beyond redemption kind of thing. Okay, so when you actually look at it, thus you get there's violence, there's plenty of violence within group. You just don't have the social structure for intergroup violence because it takes a level of societal complexity that you don't get with nomadic, mobile hunter-gatherers. Old dogma used to be is this is a band of nothing but like siblings and first and second cousins. Genetic studies show another reason why you don't get it, which is no, there's much more genetic intermixing between groups. When there's tensions, you get up and you move to a different valley or you move to a different group, much more fluid groups that way, which is a great way of reducing tension. Okay, so what can you say at the end of this? Is there any sort of resolution there? Are we a, wartless species? Why warts come to mind? A species without warts in terms of no history of violence and stuff? No, males have been killing each other over male-male competition stuff forever. And in that regard, we look just like all sorts of other primates out there. Humans and our ancestors almost certainly have been perfectly willing to slaughter each other one-on-one interpersonally as far back as it goes. And what is much more recent is the level of organization that only comes with agriculture and city-states and surplus, and you can afford to have a standing army and things of that kind of thing. So I think that's the resolution between the peace anthropologists and the anthropologists who make fun of the peace anthropologists, who make it sound as if all they're doing is sitting around on waterbeds and getting stoned and thinking it's still the 60s. That seems to be the resolution. We're not a much better species than we were then, and we weren't all that great in the past. We just didn't do it on a big organized level of taking out the folks in the next valley.
Okay, next is the question. You mentioned settlers of Catan a couple times, but seafarers, cities and knights? How far are you willing to go? What is the best strategy in your opinion? God forbid it's going for longest road. So, for those of you who might not know, which I think might actually include you, Papa, seafarers and cities and knights are expansion packs, sort of variations of the original Settlers of Catan board game. We aren't big on these official expansion packs, but we have sort of house rules, kind of our own family like expansion of sorts, where we've added bonuses and curses that we've come up with over the years. So like we never play without those now.
Okay, so amid that strategy, what is my strategy? And my first thought is I have no strategy at all. And this accounts for the fact that since you guys were like barely out of diapers, consistently I'm the worst Settlers of Catan player in the family. All of you, especially mommy, are in circles around me. But I realize, no, I actually do have a strategy, which is to just get sheep. Just get lots of sheep and get a sheep port and be willing to trade at horribly disadvantageous exchange rates to get more sheep. And this is so known in the family that here a number of years ago, they gave me this birthday present, which is a shepherd's staff because of my ridiculous ability to be manipulated into making any trade whatsoever in order to get sheep. And that accounts for my last plate finish. And despite the snarky tone to that question, I would love to have my settler skills together enough someday to decide that going for longest road is the strategy to take.
You know, pastoralists have done okay in the past, maybe just less so in this game. So, next, Kevin from New Hampshire asks, what do you think of the intersection between psychology and neurodegenerative diseases? For example, people with anxiety and depression might be at greater risk for developing dementia or Parkinson's disease. Do you think behavior or neurotransmitter modifications can possibly change disease outcomes?
Okay, great. That's two questions, and both are getting at, psychology, a whole different fish, kettle of fish, than neurobiology, and no, they're intertwined, that usual song and dance. But the first question is, are any classic neurodegenerative diseases characterized by personality changes, psychological changes? The second question is, does your lifetime sort of cumulative history of personality, style, behavior, and such have anything to do with your likelihood of getting a neurodegenerative disease? Okay, first one, are there any neurological neurodegenerative diseases that are characterized by behavioral changes? Absolutely. The two at the top of the list, one is called frontal temporal dementia, where initially you get degeneration in the frontal cortex. Frontal cortex regulating of behavior, emotional regulation, and frontal temporal dementia, Pick's disease, initially looks like someone is getting psychiatrically disinhibited. Equivalently, Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea, single gene mutation, totally interesting mutation, typically a couple of years before you get motoric problems, which is what it's about in the textbooks, you get personality changes in a direction of disinhibition. And now the people can look at someone who is destined to get Huntington's because of genetic screens. You could see a few years before the classical pattern of degeneration in the brain in Huntington's, which is in motor systems, you get degeneration in the frontal cortex. In Parkinson's disease, as it progresses, eventually it gets all sorts of parts of the brain other than simply the fine motor control, and you get what's called a subcortical dementia. You can get some personality changes as well. So, all sorts of these diseases can be started, first spotted with, or as a secondary, tertiary symptom, some sort of behavioral change. Yeah, they're inseparable, all of that. And frontal temporal dementia, given its profile, the first person somebody is taken to is usually not a neurologist. It's usually a psychiatrist or a police officer because of the inappropriateness of their behavior. Okay, but flip the other way. Are there any personality styles or histories of psychological, psychiatric problems that increase the risk for neurodegenerative disorders? And the one that I think is most interesting, and I've been watching for 30 years, bits of evidence supporting it, is does a lifetime of stress, does a lifetime of elevated levels of stress hormones, does a long history of major depression, highly intertwined with stress and an excess of those stress hormones, does that increase your chance of Alzheimer's disease? And right off the bat, the answer is absolutely not for 10% of the cases. What's called familial Alzheimer's, early onset, runs in families. It's due to a mutation. You get in your 50s, and that's got nothing. Okay, 90% of cases, late onset, sporadic, non-familial. What's the evidence? The stress? What are the risk factors? Because the whole point of these late onset ones is there's no mutation. There's just cumulative kick in the ankles of your neurons over the course of a lifetime. Oxygen radicals, concussive head traumas. Do not be a professional boxer or football player, CTE being a special flavor of that one. Don't have cerebral vascular disease because your neurons aren't getting as much oxygen. And throughout, there's been this emerging literature suggesting a history of heavy stress, not stress like, traffic jams, but trauma, PTSD, a history of heavy exposure to stress hormones like cortisol, dexamethasone, prednisone, the synthetic versions of them, increase the risk of Alzheimer's and or more likely accelerate the decline of it. And we know lots of pieces of the building blocks of that, the effects of stress and these stress hormones on, for Alzheimer's aficionados, increasing the amount of amyloid plaque, increasing the amount of soluble fibrillar amyloid fibers there that are the damaging things, accelerated production of these things called tau proteins. All of them have been shown first in animal models, a lot of which came from my lab, and then in human studies showing that, yeah, the pacemakers of Alzheimer's decline are accelerated by stress and heavy histories of exposure to these stress hormones, which takes us to, in lots of ways, the most important one down there, does depression increase the risk of late onset Alzheimer's? And it's really hard to tease apart whether the evidence is saying that appears to be a risk factor for getting late onset Alzheimer's versus that appears to be a risk factor for, once you get it, accelerated decline. But basically, the picture isn't good. Oh my God, does that mean I had an awful boss for 2.5 years back when? Is that? No. This is major league histories of intractable depression for decades and decades. Do not freak out at this point. These are treatment-resistant major depressions that are characterized by highly elevated levels of these stress hormones, but they're not at the top of the list. You know, if you're choosing between being depressed or being a professional boxer, being a professional boxer is the much more dangerous path to a neurodegenerative disease in old age. But it's, I don't know, somewhere numbers 5 to 10 among the risk factors. And for my money, that's kind of a scary thing.
That's all for episode 17. Keep submitting questions at the forum found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.